Harlem, New York, Tuesday night, June 9th, 1936. The kind of summer evening when the heat didn't sit in the air. It pressed against skin, turned shirts into wet cloth, and made tempers shorter than they had any right to be. The streets were alive the way Harlem streets were always alive after dark. Music leaking from open windows, dice games on stoops, couples moving slow, pretending the city wasn't built to grind them down. Men standing outside storefronts with the posture of people who had nothing to lose and everything to defend. And on Lenox Avenue near 135th Street, under a streetlight that flickered like it couldn't decide if it wanted to work, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood beside a black Packard and listened to a man in a police uniform speak to him like he was trash. The cop's name was Officer Frank Delaney, 34 years old, Irish, thick neck, pink face that always looked slightly sunburned even in winter. A man who wore the badge the way some men wore armor because it allowed him to behave like the rules belonged to everyone else. Delaney had stopped the Packard for nothing. No speeding, no swerving, no broken tail light. He had stopped it because he saw who stepped out of the back seat. Bumpy Johnson. Johnson was dressed the way he always dressed when he wanted the city to understand he was not hiding. Dark suit, crisp shirt, tie knotted tight, shoes polished so clean they looked wet. He could have passed for a banker if you didn't know what bankers really were in New York. Delaney walked up with two other cops behind him, not because he needed backup, but because in 1936, white cops liked to travel in packs when they came to Harlem. They liked an audience. Delaney didn't ask for a license. He didn't ask where Johnson was going. He didn't pretend it was routine. He looked Johnson up and down slowly and smiled like a man who had just found something to break. "Well, look at this," Delaney said loudly, so the people on the sidewalk could hear. Harlem royalty out for a ride. A few pedestrians stopped, not because they were curious, because they were cautious. They had learned the hard way that watching a cop humiliate a black man could get you beaten too. Delaney stepped closer, close enough that Johnson could smell alcohol under the peppermint Delaney probably chewed to hide it. "I know you," Delaney said. "You're that numbers man, the one who thinks he's a businessman." Johnson didn't respond. He just looked at Delaney's face with that calm stare that made people uncomfortable, because it wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was assessment. Delaney's smile widened as if Johnson's silence amused him. "You know what I like about you people?" Delaney said. "You dress up real nice. You put on your little suits, you buy your little cars, and you start believing the city forgot what you are." One of Delaney's partners chuckled. Delaney turned his head, enjoying the laugh, enjoying the power of having men beside him who wouldn't question anything. Then Delaney turned back to Johnson and did something that changed the air on the street. He leaned in and spit. Not accidentally, not a stray drop, not a disrespectful cough. A deliberate wet spit that landed on the front of Johnson's white shirt, just below the tie knot, right where everyone could see it. For half a second, the street went silent, in the way it goes silent when something crosses a line so clearly that everyone knows they just watched a point of no return. Bumpy Johnson looked down at his shirt. He watched the spit slide. He lifted his eyes back to Delaney's. Delaney was grinning now, not just confident, but thrilled, like he had finally forced the moment he wanted. "You gonna do something about it?" Delaney asked. His voice carried. Because this wasn't only between them. This was for Harlem to see. A message in the language cops used when they wanted a neighborhood to remember its place. Delaney took one step closer. "You touch me," he said, "and I'll drag you down to the station, and I'll have my boys put you in a cell so dark you'll forget your own name. Then I'll come back tomorrow and do it again." Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. He didn't reach into his jacket. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even wipe the spit off immediately. He just stared at Delaney for 3 seconds. Long enough that the grin on Delaney's face tightened. long enough that one of Delaney's partners shifted his feet, long enough that the people watching from the sidewalk felt something crawling up their backs, the sense that the moment wasn't ending the way it was supposed to. Then Bumpy Johnson spoke. Quiet, even, so calm it didn't sound like a threat. "Officer," Johnson said, "you made a decision tonight." Delaney snorted. "Oh, yeah?" Johnson nodded once. "You decided you could do that to me in public." Delaney leaned back slightly, enjoying himself. "I can do whatever I want." Johnson's expression didn't change. "That's what you think," he said. Delaney laughed, loud, theatrical, like he was playing to the street. "Get out of here," he said, waving a hand. "Go cry to your little Harlem friends." Bumpy Johnson looked down at his shirt again, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He dabbed the spit once, not frantic, not humiliated, just precise. Then he folded the handkerchief, put it back in his pocket, and took a step toward his car. Delaney called after him, voice sharp with contempt. "Yeah, that's right," he said. "Walk away." Johnson paused at the door. He turned his head just enough to look back, and he said something so quiet that Delaney almost didn't hear it. "Enjoy your walk home," Johnson said. Delaney's grin twitched. "What was that?" he barked. Johnson didn't repeat it. He got into the car. The Packard pulled away smoothly, disappearing into Harlem traffic like nothing happened. Delaney stood in the streetlight glow, still smiling, still believing he had won. He believed he had reminded Harlem what the badge meant. He believed he had publicly degraded the neighborhood's most famous operator and gotten away with it. He went back to his precinct later that night with a story to tell, a story about how he spit on Bumpy Johnson, and the great Bumpy Johnson did nothing. Delaney didn't know he had just triggered something that would move through the city like a silent chain reaction. Because Officer Frank Delaney went off shift on Friday, June 12, 1936. And he never came home. To understand how a single spit in Harlem turned into a police officer vanishing from New York, vanishing so thoroughly that even the men who wore the same uniform whispered about it, you have to understand three things about Bumpy Johnson. First, Johnson did not treat disrespect like emotion. He treated it like information. If someone disrespected you in public, it wasn't only an insult. It was a declaration of how far they believed they could go. And if you allowed that declaration to stand, you didn't just lose pride, you lost territory. Second, Johnson understood the city's real hierarchy, not the hierarchy written on paper, not the hierarchy in speeches, the hierarchy of leverage, who owed whom, who could ruin whom, who could make problems appear. And the NYPD, especially in the 1930s, was not a monolith. It was a marketplace, a system of favors and bribes and quiet arrangements where certain cops made money by pretending to enforce the law while actually selling it piece by piece. Third, Johnson did not strike where the city expected him to strike. A hot-headed man would have swung at Delaney in the street. A reckless man would have tried to shoot him later. A desperate man would have begged a politician for help. Johnson did none of that, because Johnson understood something that separates men who survive from men who become cautionary tales. If you attack the badge directly, the whole institution comes down on you. But if you isolate the man inside the badge, if you expose his secret weaknesses, separate him from his protection, make him look dirty even to his own people, then the institution does what institutions always do. It sacrifices him. The spit wasn't the real crime. The spit was the spark. The real crime, the mistake Delaney made, was assuming Bumpy Johnson didn't have the power to turn the city's machinery against him. Johnson went home that night and did not sleep. Not because he was shaking with rage, because his mind was already working. Who was Delaney? Which precinct? Which route? Which habits? Which vices? Cops in Harlem weren't saints. They gambled. They drank. They chased women. They took envelopes. They made side money on the very crime they pretended to stop. And men like Delaney, men who spit on someone in public, usually did it because they believed they were untouchable. Untouchable men always have the same flaw. They stop hiding. At 2:18 a.m. Wednesday morning, Johnson made his first call. Not to a killer, to an accountant, a man named Solomon "Solly" Marks, who specialized in tracking money that didn't want to be tracked. Marks didn't ask why. He didn't need to. When Johnson asked for a name to be looked into, Marks understood the job was to find out where the man's life was soft. Johnson's second call went to Theodore Green, the same attorney who handled Johnson's formal business and his informal negotiations. Green was the kind of lawyer who could speak to bankers at noon and speak to gangsters at midnight without changing his tone. Johnson's third call went to a man who would never be mentioned in any newspaper story about what happened next. A man in uniform. A detective named Walter Haskins, assigned downtown but with family in Harlem and a taste for money that made him flexible about morality. Haskins had done small favors for Johnson before. Not murder favors. Information favors. Names. Internal rumors. Which cop was taking what? Which supervisor was looking the other way? Johnson didn't ask Haskins for anything dramatic on that call. He asked one question. "Frank Delaney," Johnson said, "tell me where he bleeds." Haskins paused, then exhaled slowly. "You got a problem with Delaney?" he asked. Johnson's voice stayed calm. "He made it his business," Johnson said. "Now it's mine." The next day, Wednesday, Delaney went to work like normal. He walked his beat like a man wearing protection. He took his coffee, joked with the desk sergeant, made comments about Harlem people like they weren't human. He told the story about spitting on Bumpy Johnson twice before noon. And every time he told it, he laughed. Because Delaney believed the story proved something, that the badge mattered more than any Harlem name. What Delaney didn't see was that from Wednesday onward, he was being watched in a way cops rarely notice until it's too late. Not by obvious men, not by teenagers on corners, by quiet professionals, drivers, deliverymen, men who looked like they belonged anywhere. They watched Delaney's patterns, when he left the precinct, which bar he visited, which woman he visited, which gambling spot he favored, which alley he used to take envelopes from. And by Thursday morning, Johnson had what he needed. Officer Frank Delaney wasn't clean. He wasn't even careful. Delaney had two major vulnerabilities and one fatal weakness. Vulnerability 1, money. Delaney was in debt, not the kind of debt you pay with a paycheck. Gambling debt, the kind that grows quietly in back rooms until you can't pretend it's manageable. Vulnerability 2, pride. Delaney liked to show off. He liked expensive whiskey. He liked the attention of women who liked uniformed men. He liked telling stories that made him look powerful. And the fatal weakness was this. Delaney believed Harlem couldn't touch him, which meant he took risks a smarter cop wouldn't. When Johnson built his response, he didn't build it like anger. He built it like a machine, not as a random act, as a system. 3 elements, all moving at once. Element 1. Remove Delaney's illusion of protection, make him feel exposed, make him feel isolated, make him make mistakes. Element 2. Create a reason Delaney would leave the safety of the precinct voluntarily, not dragged out, not ambushed in uniform. Voluntarily. Element 3. Make the result irreversible and frightening enough that other cops, especially the ones who enjoyed humiliating Harlem, would remember it for years. Johnson wasn't trying to start a war with the NYPD. He was trying to send a message to the specific type of cop who believed he could do anything to anyone. He wanted Delaney to become a story cops told each other quietly. Because cops do not fear sermons, they fear precedent. Thursday night, June 11th, 1936. 10:26 p.m. Delaney left a bar on 8th Avenue with a slight sway in his walk and a smile on his face. He had been drinking, he had been bragging again, and he had just been approached by a man Delaney didn't recognize. A man in a decent suit who spoke softly and acted respectful. The man didn't threaten Delaney. He didn't insult him. He offered him something Delaney's kind always believed they deserved: a payoff, a simple arrangement. The man told Delaney there was a shipment, nothing grand, just a small delivery of liquor that needed to move through Midtown without interference. "We'd like you to look the other way," the man said. Delaney's eyes sharpened, interested. "How much?" he asked. The man named a number that made Delaney's pride sit up straighter. Delaney said, "Who's behind it?" The man paused just long enough to hook Delaney's attention. "Let's just say it's Harlem money," the man said. Delaney smirked. Of course it was. Harlem was where payoffs came from. Harlem was where men like Delaney went to collect. Delaney agreed to meet the next night, Friday, after his shift. At a place the man described as quiet and safe, near the river. Delaney didn't ask too many questions, because Delaney thought he was the predator. He thought he was going to take money from criminals and go home laughing. He went home Thursday night and kissed his wife on the forehead like a man with no fear. He didn't know Harlem had already decided his weekend. Friday, June 12, 1936. The day Delaney never came home. Delaney worked his shift with an odd tightness in his posture, not fear, anticipation. He was thinking about the payoff. He was thinking about his debt. He was thinking about how easy it was to take money from Harlem. At 6:04 p.m., he clocked out. He changed out of uniform. He put on a jacket that didn't fit quite right, like a man pretending he was something he wasn't. He told the desk sergeant he had plans. He walked out into the warm summer evening and disappeared into the city. To understand what happened next, you have to understand something else about Bumpy Johnson's mind. Johnson didn't want Delaney dead in a way that made Delaney a martyr. A dead cop with a clear killer creates a crusade. It brings raids, it brings headlines, it brings the kind of pressure that collapses operations. Johnson wanted something different. He wanted Delaney to vanish, to become an unanswered question, a blank space that made cops glance over their shoulders without knowing where the danger was coming from. So Delaney walked into the meeting believing he was in control. And when he didn't come home, the city didn't know where to point its anger, because there was no obvious culprit, only consequence. At 7:31 p.m., Delaney arrived near the river on the west side. The place was quiet the way the edges of New York are quiet: industrial buildings, loading docks, darkness that feels thicker because the city noise is farther away. A car sat parked under a dim light. The man who approached him was the same man from the bar. Polite, soft-spoken. He nodded at Delaney like this was normal. "You alone?" the man asked. Delaney smirked. "What, you afraid of me?" The man smiled slightly. "Just business?" Delaney walked closer. He demanded the money. The man said it was inside, that they had to step into the building because someone was watching. Delaney rolled his eyes. He stepped inside, and that was the last confirmed sighting of Officer Frank Delaney in the normal world. Everything after that became rumor. Everything after that became Underworld, whisper. Everything after that became the kind of story police told each other with careful vagueness, because nobody wanted to admit they were scared. Here's what is certain. At 9:12 p.m., Delaney's wife called the precinct asking why her husband hadn't come home. She wasn't angry yet, just concerned. Delaney was late sometimes. He drank, he gambled, he had nights where he disappeared and came back smelling like whiskey and cheap perfume. The desk sergeant told her Delaney had clocked out. That's all he could say. At 11:40 p.m., the wife called again. This time her voice carried something different. Fear, because midnight was approaching, and Delaney, whatever else he was, always came home eventually. The desk sergeant told her they'd look into it. And then the precinct did what precincts do when one of their own goes missing. They began calling the places he liked: bars, bookmakers, a woman's apartment in Hell's Kitchen whose name Delaney's wife did not know. No one had seen him. No one claimed to know anything. By Saturday morning, Delaney was officially missing. And then the first strange thing happened. The men Delaney owed money to, men who normally would have been screaming, pounding on doors, demanding payment, went quiet. They stopped asking about him. They stopped talking. They acted like they didn't want his name in their mouths. That's how the underworld behaves when it knows something is settled. The second strange thing happened Monday. A rumor spread through Harlem that Delaney had been handled. Not arrested, not disciplined, handled. And the rumor wasn't triumphant. It wasn't a celebration. It was told the way people tell a story about a storm. Quietly, with respect, with caution, because nobody wanted to be next. The third strange thing happened Tuesday. A detective from Internal Affairs, one of the rare men in the department who actually enjoyed investigating cops, started looking into Delaney's finances. And the detective found something that made his eyebrows rise. Delaney had withdrawn money the afternoon he disappeared. Not a huge amount, but enough to suggest he was planning to pay someone, or planning to run. And Delaney had made a phone call at 6:27 p.m. Friday to a number that didn't connect to any known contact. A dead end, a payphone line. That's what made Delaney's disappearance so perfect. It didn't scream murder. It screamed dirty cop. A dirty cop who got greedy, took a meeting, and never made it back. And in the NYPD, when a dirty cop disappears, the department's instincts are conflicted. They want to find him, but they don't want to look too hard. Because looking too hard reveals the rot, and the rot leads upward. That was the genius of Johnson's response. He didn't challenge the department with a headline. He challenged it with a missing man whose disappearance highlighted everything the department wanted hidden. On Wednesday, 1 week after the spit, the Amsterdam News ran a short piece. Not a grand exposé, just a small note. A Harlem businessman had been publicly disrespected by an officer. The officer was now missing. No accusation, no names tied together explicitly. Just proximity, just implication. And New York read it the way New York always reads those little notes, as a warning. At this point, people always ask the question the police asked privately. Did Bumpy Johnson kill Delaney? The truth is, nobody who could say for certain ever said it publicly. And that's the point, because what happened next wasn't meant to be proven in court. It was meant to be understood in the street. But the underworld had its version, a version that spread because it felt like Johnson's style, cold, organized, consequence-driven. According to that version, Delaney didn't die quickly, not because Johnson was cruel for pleasure, but because Johnson wanted Delaney to understand the exact moment his life changed. That moment wasn't in the warehouse. That moment wasn't the payoff meeting. That moment was the spit, the deliberate decision to degrade a man in front of his neighborhood. And according to the whisper story, someone made sure Delaney had time to think about that. Then Delaney disappeared into the city's hidden spaces, the way people disappear when the city decides you're no longer allowed to exist. No body in an alley, no dramatic shooting in public, no scene for newspapers, just absence. And absence is more terrifying than spectacle, because a body answers the question, he's dead? A disappearance leaves the question hanging, what can happen to me if I cross the wrong line? The NYPD searched for Delaney in the standard ways. They checked morgues, they checked hospitals, they checked the river, they checked the train stations, no Delaney. But privately, many of Delaney's colleagues did something else. They stopped coming into Harlem the way Delaney came into Harlem. They stopped performing. They stopped humiliating people for sport. They still took bribes. They still shook down operators. They still did what crooked cops did, but they did it more carefully, with less contempt. Because contempt makes enemies. and enemies make you disappear. This is where the story becomes bigger than Delaney, because the aftermath wasn't the ending. The aftermath was the message that lasted. And Delaney's disappearance created 3 lasting effects in New York. Effect 1, a new rule in Harlem interactions. Cops could still enforce, they could still threaten. But public humiliation became risky. If you degraded a Harlem power publicly, you weren't just insulting a man. You were announcing you thought you could do anything. And that kind of announcement required a response, or else the whole neighborhood learned it was true. Effect 2, Delaney became a cautionary tale within the department. Not officially. Officially, Delaney was a missing officer. But unofficially, the story was told like this. He got greedy. He took Harlem money. He disappeared. It didn't matter if that was accurate. What mattered was what it taught. Don't take meetings you don't control. Don't assume your badge makes you immortal. And don't create enemies who know how to organize. Effect 3. Bumpy Johnson's reputation shifted. He was already feared. But fear of violence is common in that world. What made Johnson different is that people began to fear his precision, that he didn't strike impulsively, that he struck in ways that made institutions uncomfortable, that he could make your own corruption become the weapon that destroyed you. Bumpy Johnson never publicly claimed responsibility for Delaney's disappearance. When reporters asked about it later, he gave the kind of answer that sounded like nothing and meant everything. "I don't know that man," he said. Then he paused and added, "But I will tell you this. If you spit on people long enough, eventually you choke." Delaney's wife kept waiting. Weeks turned into months. The department eventually issued the kind of quiet statements departments issue when they want a story to fade. Officer Delaney is presumed deceased. No details, no closure, just a line on paper. And in Harlem, the story became legend, not because Harlem celebrated a missing man. Harlem knew the cost of violence. Harlem had funerals too. The legend mattered because it felt like the first time in a long time the power dynamic had reversed in a way white New York couldn't ignore. A cop had publicly degraded a Harlem figure in front of witnesses, and the cop vanished. Not arrested, not transferred, not suspended. Vanished. That shocked New York because it suggested a truth the city didn't like to say out loud. There were limits, even for the badge, especially in neighborhoods where the badge relied on silence, bribes, and the assumption that nobody could fight back without being crushed. The Delaney incident became one of those stories older Harlem men told younger Harlem men when teaching them how the world worked. Not as a moral lesson, as a strategic one. You don't react in the street, they would say. You react in the system. Don't give them what they want. Give them what they fear. And what they fear isn't your anger. They fear your ability to pull levers, money, information, reputation, until the powerful start protecting themselves from the one who caused the trouble. There's one more detail people always remembered, because it was the moment Delaney realized, too late, that he had misread Bumpy Johnson. According to one version, Delaney realized it on the Thursday night before he vanished. He was sitting in the bar, drinking, laughing with another cop telling the spit story again. And a man at the end of the bar, an older black porter, the kind of man white people didn't look at twice, turned slightly and said something Delaney didn't expect. Not a threat, not anger, just a calm statement, like weather. "You know," the porter said, "Bumpy Johnson don't forget nothing." Delaney laughed. "Who asked you?" The porter shrugged. "Nobody." Then he added, quieter, "But men who spit usually don't like what comes back." Delaney's laugh had tightened then, just for a moment. Because even arrogant men have instinct, and instinct can sense when a story is turning. But by the time Delaney's instinct whispered caution, the decision had already been made. The spit had already happened. The public humiliation had already been witnessed. And in Johnson's world, public disrespect demanded public consequence, whether the city could prove it or not. By July of 1936, cops in Harlem were still cops. They still harassed people. They still shook down small operators. But the particular cruelty Delaney displayed, that performative humiliation, that casual spit, that enjoyment of degradation, became rarer. Not because the NYPD had grown a conscience, but because fear had entered the equation. And fear changes behavior faster than sermons ever will. Officer Frank Delaney's name faded from official records the way missing men always fade. A file number, a date, he presumed. But in Harlem he stayed alive as a warning, a story attached to a simple action, a spit, a choice made in arrogance, a consequence that arrived like a shadow. And Bumpy Johnson, who had stood under that flickering streetlight and refused to react the way Delaney wanted, walked away with his dignity intact and his message delivered. Because the real power in that moment wasn't that Johnson could hurt someone. Plenty of men could hurt someone. The power was that Johnson could wait. He could plan. He could choose a response that didn't make him look like a criminal in the eyes of the city, but made the city's criminals inside the law look like what they were. That's why it shocked New York, because New York could rationalize violence, but New York didn't know what to do with a consequence that looked like the city's own corruption swallowing one of its own. And that is why people who heard the story later, whether they believed every detail or not, always remembered the headline version. A arcist cop spit on Bumpy Johnson. He never came home. And the city quietly learned the lesson it never likes to admit it learns. You can humiliate people when they're alone. You can humiliate them when you think they have no leverage. But when you humiliate the wrong man in front of the wrong witnesses, you don't just create anger, you create a plan. And plans, in New York, outlast nights. They become rules. That was 1936. That was Lenox Avenue. That was the spit heard by a whole neighborhood. And that was the disappearance that made the badge hesitate, even if only for a moment, before crossing the line again.